where I'm very, very happy to be joined once again by my good friend Vanessa Beeley. Vanessa has been an incredible journalist, somebody who's been on the ground in hotspots all around the world for many, many years. Recently, Vanessa has spent some years in Syria, and for obvious reasons, when Syria was pretty much backstabbed, had to find herself leaving to save her life, and is now based in locations I'm not going to talk about, but basically, Vanessa, your work has been incredible, and your insights into the ongoing geopolitical conflict in especially the Middle East, but you have a very global perspective too, where you can zero on events within a context which I highly appreciate. You recently did two articles that really caught my attention. Will Syria and Greater Israel collide or coexist under the Al Qaeda regime? And the other one being the more new, I think you just put this out on your Substack today, but it was published a day or two ago, which was the war against the Druze to achieve the Zionist David's corridor in Syria. There's been a lot of incredible, disappointing developments in Syria since Bashar al-Assad was ousted and an Al-Qaeda operative was retooled, rebranded. And maybe you could just say a little bit about where are we now? I mean, Israel has launched an attack. Apparently, Golani was nearly assassinated. All of these things are strange and ongoing. You made the point that there's some nuance that people are often missing when they're jumping the gun to assume certain narratives are true. Could you say a little bit more about that? What was the attack by Israel onto Syria really about?
I think from my point of view, this all happened immediately after the security meeting in Baku, Azerbaijan, between Golani and a representative from Israel, which at the time was kind of denied, and now the Jewish News has admitted that it did actually happen. And as soon as Golani came back from that meeting, and of course he'd had a previous meeting in April, also denied, but has been admitted by sources close to Golani with an Israeli envoy. And the US under Trump, of course, has been effectively trying to broker this normalization process between Syria and Israel. There's a lot of pushback from inside Israel, even because they're not in agreement with Netanyahu on this, like many factions, simply because they see Golani, to some degree, quite rightly, as a takfiri, unelected president. He doesn't have any constitutional legitimacy. He's been conducting massacres against his own people. Netanyahu has been negotiating with the US and Israeli members of the Knesset to try and bring about this kind of normalization purely for the protection of Israel's security interests in the future and their expansionism into Syria itself, which is part of, if you want to call it, the Greater Israel Plan, but it's also part of the clean break doctrine from 1997, where Israel talked about effectively fragmenting all of the Middle East into sectarian statelets, which would be, quote, more sympathetic to the Israeli regime. And of course, the beginning of that was the war against Iraq, which was the gateway to Damascus, and eventually the war against Iran. Syria had to be brought down. And of course, we saw as soon as the ceasefire agreement came into place between Hezbollah and Israel, boom, they pivoted to Syria, and we saw the invasion from Idlib, and the rest is history.
Yeah.
And so what happened after Baku, Golani came back, and in my opinion, what happened then was an orchestrated massacre in the south. For me, Netanyahu's strikes, which were blown out of all proportion, by the way, and all these, I mean, I actually woke up to about 3 messages on my mobile going, oh, there's been a coup in Damascus, Golani has fled the country. I was like, okay, let's all take a deep breath, because this isn't going to happen right now. And then sure enough, once I spoke to people on the ground, they said, no. None of the things happened that were being reported. Golani did go to Latakia on the coast with his family, and they were under Turkish protection at that time. But if you actually look at the Israeli strikes, they were largely cosmetic. They were very grandiose cosmetic strikes because they hit the center of Damascus. But actually, there were, as far as I know, no casualties. There were no assassinations. And Golani was back in Damascus in a matter of hours, from what I understand, because he gave the speech about the conflict in the south literally 24 hours later at 4 a.m.
Yeah, no, it seems very, very contrived. Yeah, and a bit of kabuki theater there. So you think this was done to
Mm.
sort of legitimize Giuliani's image in the minds of people who were critical of him, to make him seem as though he's still a Syrian nationalist who's a threat to Israel or something, as a branding, or what was this all about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a part of it.
Mm,
I think also because you've got to understand that even within Jolani's Takfiri militia, there is opposition to him because he's not giving them their Islamic caliphate that they dreamed of. That's why they came under the Jolani military umbrella in Idlib. And many of them did believe that he was going to liberate Al-Quds also, right? And the Syrian people are also sort of, although obviously it's a very muted protest because they're terrified of getting killed basically at the moment. But there is a pushback even among the Syrian people on the Palestinian issue, on the normalization with Israel issue. But there's also this aspect that Netanyahu has opposition in Israel to the normalization or any kind of security agreement with Jolani. So I think Netanyahu also had to look as if he was targeting HTS, right?
mm.
And if you look at who actually conducted the massacres against the Druze communities in the south, it was these so-called tribal factions. I mean,
Mm.
there are millions. There's 6 major tribes in Syria. And I think around 41 kind of splinter factions from those main 6 are the ones that participated in the massacre. But what this actually reminded me of was Sabra and Shatila in 1982 in Lebanon, when the Zionists stood back and allowed the phalangists to go ahead and massacre the Palestinians. So they achieved plausible deniability. They didn't do it, they tried to stop it. Not that they actually said that. And the phalangists were given free rein to massacre the Palestinians. And that's exactly what we saw in Syria, which was Giuliani established these so-called checkpoints on the road from Damascus to Sueda. But there's multiple videos showing when the tribal factions actually reached the checkpoints, the guys stood back and let them go through. And we now have also multiple videos showing HTS militia, even his so-called special forces, the Red Banners, participating with the tribal factions in the atrocities committed against the Druze communities in Soweto, which includes the city itself and all the surrounding villages.
Mm. On that issue, so there's sort of 3 topics that I'm going to want to try to weave together before our
Mm,
interview is out. But the first one being, up until now, the the Druze communities themselves play a very special role in Syria's history, especially since the 1925 revolution, the overthrow of the French mandate, especially
yeah.
in that fight. And you go through that in your article quite a bit. So but at the same time, the Druze are not simply one thing. There seem to be
Yeah.
factions within the Druze as well. I've always been very confused by the Druze, and only recently did I start really thinking about, like, well, what are the Druze? What are the Alawites? Like,
Yeah.
what are the Yazidis? So it's kind of like a new thing, and
Mm-mm.
I started later than I should have, sort of appreciating the highly diverse tapestry of different groups, ethnicities, religious groups in Syria, which you've pointed out is both a strength and a weakness. The
Yeah.
Druze specifically, though, are playing a big role in this particular story. The Alawites have just suffered a massive massacre, and it seems like something similar is going on right now, utilizing these proxies,
Mm.
these tribal proxies. Um, But some Druze seem to be very much in favor of Zionism. You've mentioned
Yeah.
a couple of characters, shady characters, who are playing a bit of a very negative role. Some of them seem to have the idea of restoring some autonomous province or maybe even a little country, a jurisdiction that the French once had granted to the Druze a century ago. That they want to
Mm.
create sort of like a Druze version of Kurdistan. And then you've got a lot of like really noble Druze who are just really good patriots who are trying to just stay alive and restore dignity to themselves and their people. But what can you elaborate a little bit more about what is going on? How are the Druze being manipulated? Who are the factions right now? And what are the Druze? What are the Druze as well?
Well, I mean, the Druze is basically a branch of Islam, kind of. It's a monotheistic religion, so it believes only in the one God, which is what relates it to Islam. It believes in it's a very secretive faith or religion. People do call it a cult. I think that's a little bit unfair to kind of tarnish it with that brush. But it is known as being quite a closed community. And I have spent considerable time with the Druze in Syria because there was a previous massacre in 2018 by ISIS against the Druze in Sweda City and in the eastern villages, which is where I spent a lot of time immediately after the massacre. And I would say it's not necessarily secretive. It's very traditional. It's very conventional within its own beliefs and traditions and conventions, but very open, very warm, very hospitable. Actually, pretty much as are all of the religious minorities in Syria and have been historically until now. That of course they're being driven into degrees of sectarian hatred that actually is completely alien to Syria. That's why I think everyone is so traumatized by what is going on there, because it's something that Syria has never really witnessed before. And it's a sort of, I guess that's what it is. It takes aspects of Christianity, aspects of Judaism. It empowers women, very importantly. It believes in including women in prayer, in all aspects of the religion, even though in a sense it's as I said, a very conservative community, but women are given a very important place in that society. They're probably closest to the Alawites, actually, and I know that you've been looking quite closely at their history. But yeah, as you said, there is a divide also even within the Druze. There's the Druze led by Sheikh Hikmat Hirji, who was effectively running kind of separatist operations even while President Assad was still in power, I think for the last 18 months before the fall of Damascus. And that was very much backed by Israel, with, of course, the proviso of Israel taking control of Sweda and all of the south pretty much, and then extending up the eastern flank of Syria on the border with Jordan and Iraq to create what they call the David's Corridor. And then there are factions within the Druze who are actually pro-Golani. I think Laith al-Balous is the leader of that faction. That's definitely a minority. And also Hirji's sector is a minority. The huge majority are against both Golani and Israel and believe in the territorial integrity of Syria. And we have to remember there were generals like General Aysam Zahreddin, who was fighting up until 2017 within the Syrian Arab Army. He liberated Deir ez-Zor from ISIS. And then he died driving over an ISIS mine. And of course, Jolani's militia desecrated his tomb on the road between Damascus and Sueda, and then blew it up, very much as, of course, they did with the tomb of Hafiz al-Assad, which they burned to the ground within days of taking over Damascus. You know, and this is something also, Matt, we've talked about this before. This is the eradication of history. This is the eradication of civilization, just as ISIS did in Palmyra. back in 2016, 2017, they blew up the entire kind of stadium, the statue of Queen Zenobia. The history of all these countries, including Palestine, including Lebanon, the attacks on Baalbek, for example, the attacks on the temples in Yemen very early on in the Saudi war of aggression against Yemen. This is all about the eradication of Arab civilization, history, and culture. That's a big part of this war.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like so much of the strategy to get that done was laid out so thoroughly in the clean break doctrine that you just
Yeah.
outlined at the very in your opening remarks. And I don't know why people don't look at that playbill, because that's exactly what's been followed to the T. And within that list of nations to
Mm.
be regime changed in favor of securing the realm for Greater Israel is Lebanon. And you pointed out in that after
Yeah.
Syria would be toppled, Lebanon was high up on the hit list. Iran was ultimately the big trophy. More
Mm.
recently, Lebanon, you pointed out in your recent writings, has been certainly targeted in a number of ways. We had the elimination of many of their qualified leaders not that long ago,
Mm.
through some major strikes by Israel. Would have involved probably some sleeper cells inside of it, Lebanon, possibly to allow to provide locations and what have you. But all that to say, it happened, and now you pointed out that there are different approaches to destroying Lebanon in play currently. One of which is being managed by Tom Barrack, who has made certain demands onto Lebanon.
Yeah.
Others involve an expectation of just destabilizing it through civil war. Others through other aspects through Syria, through Golani's efforts as well, that might be playing a role in it. So maybe could you go through some of those details on how these strategies are being gamed out to threaten Lebanon?
Yeah, of course. I mean, of course, since the ceasefire, which came into effect in the end of November, November the 27th, 2024, of course, Israel has not respected the ceasefire for 1 second. It's hunting down civilians and Hezbollah fighters from the north to the south and conducting drone assassinations on a daily basis. It hasn't left the 5 high points in southern Lebanon, where it's now establishing basically surveillance and military outposts. And of course, it took over very early on after the fall of Damascus. It took over Mount Hermon, which is actually on Syrian territory, but it's the highest point from where you can actually surveil pretty much most of Lebanon to the coast and most of Syria to Damascus. So it's a very important strategic point for Israel to have full control over in the event of an escalation against Lebanon. And so enter Tom Barrack, the economic hitman for Trump, who effectively has been pressuring the Lebanese government to disarm Hezbollah, which is never going to happen. I mean, even through popular opinion, it's never going to happen, because since the ceasefire, people have seen how ineffectual, or really, to be fair, how the Lebanese army is not allowed to be effective against Israel, because it's the US that sponsors the Lebanese army, and the US absolutely ensures that they don't have the weapons, they don't have air defense, they don't have an air force to speak of, they don't have the ability to defend the country against either a full-on Israeli invasion or against a Takfiri attack from the north and the east. And so people really, most people, even those who are to a degree opposed to Hezbollah here, and I am in Lebanon, I think you can let people know that, but I've been speaking to many factions who historically would be opposed to Hezbollah, but who I know for a fact now are looking to Hezbollah to protect their communities if there is an escalation in violence from Golani's side, right? So the disarmament idea is ridiculous, but Tom Barrack knows that. He knows the same in Iraq. He's basically trying to broker the same agreement in Iraq that the Iraqi government will all of the resistance factions in Iraq also. And of course, the PMU is now effectively part of the official Iraqi military. So this is, again, it's not achievable, because even the Druze in Syria learned from the Alawites that they're not going to disarm. Because what would have happened if they
No,
had disarmed and the
they would have been
tribal
killed.
factions had entered Swaida and slaughtered them?
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
they did slaughter them, but at least they were able to defend themselves actually very well, considering that they were completely up against an asymmetric force.
So how does
And then,
Lebanon get it? Oh,
sorry,
sorry. Yeah, no, you go, and then I'm gonna ask you a question. Okay.
sorry,
Yeah.
I'll just quickly, because also Barrack is putting financial pressure on, so he's threatening to close down the Hezbollah banking system, which is a totally usury-free banking system. So people bring their gold, they deposit their gold, it's given a valuation, and they're lent the money according to that valuation. But once they've paid back the loan, they come and take their gold. So it's basically interest-free banking, which of course is anathema to the American supremacist banking system, right? And so Barrack is threatening the financial systems in Lebanon. He's threatening no reconstruction until Hezbollah disarms. So he's effectively blackmailing the Lebanese government into putting pressure on Hezbollah. The Lebanese government, of course, know that. And actually, I think deep down, the Lebanese government know that really it's not a good idea for Hezbollah to disarm. And at the same time, Barrack is basically coming out with statements that unless Lebanon releases the Wahhabi type prisoners that Golani is demanding be sent back to Syria, which he claims he's going to then prosecute. Of course he isn't. They're just going to be added to his Takfiri militia. Then Golani considers he has the right to annex Tripoli and areas of Bekaa in the east, the Bekaa Valley, as being part of Greater Syria. And that's where I was talking about, is Greater Israel and Greater Syria going to collide, or are they working cohesively to effectively weaken the resistance in the region? And an important point that I want to make here, the ceasefire with Iran was for Israel to resupply its munitions, its interceptors, and so on, yes. But I think every time we see a ceasefire, we see a pivot to another stage in the long war against Iran. And I immediately said this is going to be a pivot towards destroying Lebanese and Iraqi resistance. In case, or rather, not in case, when there is a reignition of the aggression against Iran in the future. Not that Iran actually asked any of the resistance factions to come to their help, but who knows what might happen in the future. And it is a weapon that Iran can use. If, for example, the war escalates against Iran, the Iraqi resistance would target the American bases in Iraq. I also wrote about this, Iran's ring of fire in the region, which would threaten all American bases in the region were there really a massive escalation in aggression against Iran.
Quick question. How did Lebanon become dependent on the United States of all places to provide their defensive infrastructure? I mean, you pointed out the example of how in similar time frame, the U.S. gave 3 hand-me-down propeller aircraft fitted with like Reaper missiles or something to Lebanon, and at that same time they gave 75
Yeah,
F-35 jets
billions.
to Israel.
Yeah.
Yeah, like how did Lebanon become dependent on the US for that? What's
It's
going
always, to a large degree, been dependent on the US and then later Saudi Arabia and so on. Lebanon's always struggled with this.
on?
To actually kind of, I'm probably not well informed enough on when it actually
Okay.
kicked in. But for as long as I know, Lebanon has been, pretty much US occupied. I mean, if you go and look at the US embassy here, it's the size, if you look at it proportionately
It's like a city.
compared to the green zone in Baghdad, it's a mountain. No,
Yeah.
it's a whole mountain. I mean, they've taken over a whole mountain. It's vast. I drove past it. It took us 20 minutes to drive past the external wall.
Oh, yeah.
It's
Yeah.
insane. It's a military garrison with underground tunnels. It has access to the sea. It has helicopter
Yeah.
pads. It has landing strips. It has automatic gun turrets all around it, and so on. And there was something else I was gonna. It's gone. I'll have
It's okay.
to
It'll come
remember it
back
in
at
a
like at
second.
yeah 2 a.m. At 2 a.m. you'll wake up and it'll be like, ah, that was it.
Yeah.
Um, well, yeah, that's a good. So a lot of people say that Lebanon, Hezbollah, especially, are proxies of Iran and all of these things. And I mean, there's certainly collaboration between like Hezbollah and Iran, but I mean, to say they're proxies when they're so dependent on U.S. and they're a bastion, a hub of control of the U.S. military power projection, is bewildering that this level of deceit could become so popularly believed. Um, but okay, so what would be the seduction? Like we see the stick that Barrack is using to threaten Lebanon to disarm, and oh, what is he trying to say would be the sugar? What's the carrot? What's the incentive that they're
Oh,
offering Lebanon?
yeah. The sugar is investment. The
Oh,
sugar
yeah,
is the Saudi money, the Gulf money to rebuild.
yeah, yeah,
Because the South was destroyed in the latest war. I mean, Israel just bombed entire towns and villages into dust, just as it's done in Gaza. So there is a need for reconstruction funding. And Hezbollah doesn't have that kind of funding. Yeah, I mean that's the point I was going to make when we talk about the Cessnas, right? I was at the funeral of Said Hassan Nasrallah, the assassinated leader of Hezbollah, and the during the funeral, 4 Israeli jets buzzed overhead.
yeah,
Basically, we were told afterwards that they were going to bomb the funeral, but they were threatened by Iran and Yemen. That if they did, then basically Israel would be wiped off the map. So they backed off, but they basically flew twice over the funeral, very low. And there were, I don't know, reports of over 1 million people at the funeral, not only Lebanese, but people from outside. There were huge contingents from Europe and the UK and so on that attended. But kind of a comical moment was when the 4 jets came over and Netanyahu claimed that they were the jets that had killed Syed Hassan Nasrallah. But the first time they came over, the Cessna was actually in the sky. And the kind of the shock wave from the 4 Israeli jets, the Cessna was like this overhead. It was struggling to actually maintain a straight line. So that for me was utterly symbolic of how the US has empowered Israel and effectively kept Lebanon unable to defend itself at any time in the future. And I mean, they don't even have air defense. They have some man pads, or Hezbollah does. And I think, yeah, I want to make an important point about this idea of a proxy. I mean, Hezbollah was formed in 1982 after Sabra and Shatila, but after the Israeli invasion and so on. And Iran at that point, since the Islamic Revolution, yes, it did have a policy, an anti-imperialist policy of effectively coming to the aid of any resistance to imperialism or to Israel, effectively, right? Because it was supportive of the Palestinian cause and so on. But Iran would not perceive any of these resistance movements, including Yemen, including in Iraq, in Lebanon, and formerly, of course, in Syria, as being a proxy. They are allies, and Iran is an ally of all these, whether they are state or non-state actors. Iran is an ally. And, when we look at, hang on, but the US is supplying how many billions of weapons to Israel, and yet nobody says, well, Israel is a proxy of the US, or Saudi is a proxy of Israel and the US, or in fact, that the US is a proxy of Israel and Saudi Arabia when it's waging war against Syria or against Yemen or against, you know what I mean? Nobody makes that kind of connection, right?
yeah,
So
yeah,
it's always Iran and its proxies, and it's always the US and its partners.
yeah. No, no, the hypocrisy is loud. So you You made the point that the greater Israel agenda, the greater Syria agenda definitely are not necessarily compatible. To what degree the Syria is currently not it's clearly not a sovereign entity. It's run by a bunch of mismanaged proxies and puppets. So there does seem to be a plan to simply allow for an expansionist agenda to clear the way or the elimination to provide for the elimination of most of those agencies that might be troublesome to Greater Israel ultimately. But this also brings up the issue of the Greater Turkey, or the neo-Ottomanists who have their own
Yeah.
vision of an expansionist Turkey that even seems to involve some relationship to Azerbaijan, which
Yeah.
is also acting in a bit of a troublesome way with Armenia these days. Could you say a little bit,
Not
speak
only
to that a little
Armenia.
bit? Mm,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, let's go back to shortly after the fall of Damascus, and Russia was effectively among the first to normalize with Golani, or al-Sharaa, as he's now been rebranded, when Belarus was sent to actually broker the meeting. And then afterwards, Bogdanov, the deputy foreign minister, came and met with Golani. Now, that was all about maintaining Russian bases on the coastal region of Syria. At that point, Russia was very dependent on Turkey, as it always has been, actually, throughout the regime change war against Syria. Turkey and Russia collaborated over, for example, the ceasefire in Idlib, which in my opinion was a huge mistake, to maintain it as long as they did. And even at the end, there were Ukrainian special forces training
mm.
Golani and his militia for the last 12 months before the launch of the regime change at the end of last year. And
And
what we saw in the sorry.
so you had Ukrainian special forces in Turkey training the Julani forces
No, in Idlib.
in Idlib specifically. Okay, wow, I
Yeah,
didn't e- that
yeah.
was totally under my radar. Okay, all right, go on. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I did.
for about the last year, there were Ukrainian special forces, and
Mm,
also in the northeast, by the way,
mm,
meeting with the Kurds.
mm.
So both sides of the north of Syria, and with Jolani, it was kind of a quid pro quo because they were training them in drone technology and military warfare, guerrilla warfare, etc. And then Jolani was sending militia to Ukraine to fight against Russia. So this was ongoing for the last 12 months. And to be honest, Idlib was a huge mistake. It enabled from 2020 until 2024, Jolani to build a force, to equip a force. I mean, Russia never shut down the humanitarian corridors, even though they knew they were being used to supply weapons to Jolani. They actually argued at the UN they should be kept open for 6 months, 6 months, 6 months, etc. And I spoke to Russians at the time, both in the military and at the UN. And I was like, why are you doing this? Like, that this is basically a channel for weapons to come into Jolani. It's an access point for Turkish military to come in. I can't remember, there were tens of Turkish military bases pre-2024. And they were targeting border towns and villages. They were providing the drone surveillance for the Takfiri factions to target civilians in the cities and towns and villages and countryside on the kind of informal border or front line. Again, I went there. I went to one of the outlying towns, and we were actually shelled while we were there. And that was Turkey providing the surveillance. So to a degree, Russia did nothing about that, which was frustrating for the Syrians. It was frustrating for Hezbollah and Iran because they understood what was going on in the northwest. And then basically coming back to after the Bogdanov meeting, I think, in fact, no, I know Israel got involved lobbying on behalf of Russia. So they were lobbying Trump and saying, look, we prefer to have Russia on the coast because it's a stop for Turkish expansion. So this is a very important point. Israel and Russia are actually united against Turkish neo-Ottoman expansionism. And for me, Russia has always had an ideological relationship with Israel. I mean, many resistance people here tell me, look, the red line for Russia is Israel. That's why we understood Russia was never going to be an ideological ally in Syria, which it was proven it wasn't. It was a pragmatic geopolitical ally who saw an advantage to keeping its base on the coast, and it saw Assad as a partner in most of its objectives in the region up to a point. But at the point where it wanted Assad to pivot towards Saudi Arabia and UAE, it wanted a new constitution written. It wanted Assad to meet with Erdogan, and all of those points were effectively being delayed or stopped by Assad. I think they just said, okay, forget it. Like, we'll navigate whatever the future is in Syria, but there's no point in us staying there. And they abandoned it. They really did. I mean, I was on the ground in the last few days. Russia was bombing empty ground. It wasn't bombing the HTS convoys. It abandoned the Syrian army in Aleppo. And it forced the retreat of the Syrian army to a point where they couldn't defend it. It's a complex situation from a military perspective, but Russia was definitely a player who exacerbated the situation. They also turned back Iranian reinforcements, despite having told Assad they would allow them into Haimamin. Eventually, they turned them back, and they had to go back to Tehran. So really what we're seeing now is a reshaping of the alliances. And I think very strongly Israel and Russia are allied against the whole Erdogan neo-Ottoman project. And we saw, because when, this is why Erdogan is making all these points about a unified Syria. Of course he's saying that because he wants control over it. Erdogan is positioning himself as the leader of the Muslim world. And of course, that also brings him into conflict with Saudi Arabia and with Iran to a degree, but definitely with Saudi Arabia. So Turkey and Qatar are allied as the Muslim Brotherhood faction. Saudi Arabia is very much with Israel and to a degree Russia. Russia's been supplying weapons and has been doing arms deals with Saudi Arabia for ages, huge deals, actually. And UAE is kind of definitely in the Saudi Arabia camp and very close to Israel. It's developing all of the AI authoritarian tech for surveillance and targeting of distance that, of course, has also been used during the genocide of Palestinians by Israel. So that's their collaboration, which China is also heavily involved in. By the way, China and UAE have a very strong partnership in the development of surveillance tech and AI and so on.
Well, sorry, go on.
No. So basically that's it. So the shifting has been Israel, Russia against Turkey. And when Turkey has tried to expand, when it's tried to come into central Syria bases, for example, to provide air defense for HTS and to set up military presence there, it's been bombed. Israel has effectively bombed it back to the border areas. So Israel is only going to allow Turkey to annex the very north because it has the control through the Syrian National Army, which is the former Free Syrian Army. And then, sorry, just to mention Azerbaijan, you've got really Azerbaijan is almost becoming the hub of the next stage against Iran, in my opinion, because you've got the Zangazor corridor, which has been bubbling under the surface, which also threatens Russia, because if Russia loses control of Armenia, apparently they're rebuilding troop presence in Armenia at the moment. I read something yesterday.
Well, I was reading that there's like 1,000 U.S. troops who are being authorized to go down and manage the U.S. component of the Zangazor corridor as well. That's been sold to a private company or something like that. Yeah,
exactly. And of course, we know that means Israel, right?
Yeah.
And Israel has been supplying the weapons to Azerbaijan for decades. So Azerbaijan, Baku, and then of course that's going to be a problem for the Russian-Iranian north-south corridor. because that traverses Baku. So I'm actually doing some work on the corridors at the moment because I find it quite fascinating how now they are literally becoming a war theater of their own, in their own right. Because now we're seeing deployment to these areas where the corridors intersect, for example, at Baku, which is because Turkey also is looking at its middle corridor going from Baku across Armenia, Azerbaijan, and back into Turkey. Iran is trying to create the Aras corridor, which would circumnavigate the Zangazor corridor and drop into Iranian territory because it knows what the threat is. It knows if Israel and US troops are in the Zangazor corridor, they're on the border with Iran. And they're in an area where there is, to some degree, a potential for inciting opposition against the Iranian leadership because you're in Iranian Kurdistan then, right? And it's in my view, it's no accident that President Raisi was killed in the helicopter crash. I know Iran has said it was an accident, but I don't know.
The fact that it happened right on
skeptical
the
of that.
no, the timing of
And
it,
the
the fact
timing.
it's
Yeah.
and it happened right on the border of Azerbaijan too. So let me ask you, what do you think? I have a number of contacts who are Iranian who have very negative feelings about Zekian and who's Azari born himself. Do you feel like that he's a legitimate patriot, or do you think that he's a liability for the security of Iran as in general? Like, do you think because he came in over the dead body of Raisi, do you think that
Yeah.
there was something more subversive that happened when Raisi died, and you had a bit of a governance shift? Or or is that not something you if you don't want to comment on that too, and just
No,
if you're
it's
in data
fine. I mean,
collecting, okay,
no,
yeah,
no, no, no. I mean,
okay,
a lot of people have said to me they believed it was an internal assassination. In other words, yes, potentially to bring in a reformist government that would pivot very much towards the West and attempt to weaken the resistance. And I think if you look at, go back to the Brookings Institution Path to Persia, Which Path to Persia paper
right,
written in 2009. This is all part of the strategy that's laid out in that paper, very, very clinically. And so for me, although he was elected, I mean, Iran demonstrated greater democracy than the US at that point. He was brought in on a majority vote, and I think the West thought, great, we have got someone we can actually pressure now, and I think they tried through the renaissance of the nuclear deal, which was always going to be a kind of switch and bait tactic by Trump to push them into a corner where effectively he was demanding that they cross all their red lines, they stop uranium enrichment, they stop their missile program, etc., which Iran was never going to do. That was never going to happen. So again, just as with Hezbollah or with Hamas, this is what they do in these negotiations. They agree a certain outline of negotiations, and then they push the boundaries to the point where Hamas refuses or Hezbollah refuses, and then they're painted as being the ones that are sabotaging the negotiations, right? This is a familiar tactic. But I think what was interesting, what happened in the 12-day war, was the unification of the Iranian people. And as someone actually said to me, most of the young generation have no idea what we went through during the Iraq-Iran war, where we developed this nationalist fervor because we understood that the country was under attack. And they said now the young people actually have a sense of that feeling. And even those who were against the hijab law, who were being incited to protest by Western media or Persian media that has been infiltrated by the West and so on, suddenly changed tack completely and are fully united behind the Iranian army, the IRGC, and the supreme leadership, because they know that that's what's going to defend their country. And in a micro scale, that's what's going to happen in Lebanon if Golani attacks. Is people will be asking Hezbollah to come and protect them, right? So it's a in a sense, it's a very difficult balance for the West and for Israel to run these operations. My opinion, Israel can't go backwards. How can it? It can't sit down to a negotiating table. It's done too much damage. Even if you if you get rid of Netanyahu, it makes no difference, really. The majority of Israel now is far, far right wing and want the extermination of Palestine. They don't want Palestinians there anymore, right? So it's not going to change anything. Israel can't go backwards. It has to go forwards. It has to go through with its plans, whatever they are. And I think what you're going to see now is an attempt to infiltrate Iran through, for example, an area like the Zangazor corridor in Armenia, Azerbaijan. You're going to see attempts to infiltrate, to create internal destabilization. I don't know if we're going to see an aggression like we saw in June for some time now. And I think then the other plan, and that's why Golani is important, to use him as a battering ram against Lebanon and against Iraq, harnessing his Takfiri elements to attack Lebanon, attack Iraq, using ISIS probably in Iraq, to try and completely destroy or destabilize them or disarm the resistance in those two countries.
Yes. Yeah, I could see that too. In the case of Iran, it seems like any serious coup or overthrow or the fall of the Iranian government would strike me as being fatal for the viability of the Greater Eurasian Partnership and all of this. I mean, it's been inspiring over the last 12 years just to see the creative flanking maneuvers that were made possible through the idea, the strategy of the highly flexible Belt and Road Initiative and its various expressions in different ways. It's like the biggest project human civilization's ever done. And the prospects of it providing so much goodness to the world and stability has been very, very from my heart. But at the same time, it's contingent upon a strong Iranian government. We know that,
yeah,
not entirely, but in a big way. I mean, we know that seriousness was behind both Russia and China signing very big economic, security, energy deals with Iran. Do you think that if Iran were attacked in a more serious way, since obviously you're right, I don't think a loud attack is going to happen soon. They're probably, like you said, building up asymmetrical capabilities around in preparation and maybe within Iran in preparation for the next assault, as well as destabilizing all of the other areas that Israel would like to expand into using Golani and friends. But do you think that China and Russia could be drawn into a war in defense of Iran? Is that like a serious threat, or do you think that they would stay out of it if it came to a real threat of Iran's survival?
I mean, I would slightly turn it around. I think Iran also has a policy of strategic independence. So to a large degree, it has been very adamant. I know there was a lot of backwards and forwards, and Russia was saying Iran didn't need help, and Iran was to a degree berating Russia for not coming, and so on. But I think from really a strategic position, Iran prefers to act independently. Now, what I found quite interesting was during the 12 days how Pakistan actually very outspokenly came to the support of Iran. And we know after the skirmish between India and Pakistan that China is very much supporting Pakistan with Chinese weapons, which were very successful against NATO weapons, particularly the French, the Rafale and so on, that were absolutely decimated by the Chinese defense systems and attack systems, right? So for me, it would almost make more sense if China, in the event of a bigger escalation, that China would perhaps supply through Pakistan if Pakistan maintains. And that's why, of course, now we're seeing the US start the Free Imran Khan campaign, not because they love Imran Khan, but because they perceive the current government as being pro-Iran. So they'll try to destabilize Pakistan in preparation for the war against Iran. right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And to shut out China. Which is kind of, again, it's all happening around Iran. That's the point. It's not happening directly at Iran right now. And then I think with Russia, I mean, it's kind of interesting. They have this strategic partnership, and Fiorella and I have talked about this. The fact that with North Korea, Russia has a mutual defense clause in their strategic partnership. So if anyone attacks North Korea, then Russia will come to their defense. With Iran, there isn't this clause. What Russia has said, because of course, who is likely to attack Iran? It's going to be Israel, right? And the US, or the Zionist bloc, as I call them. And there isn't a clause in there for mutual defense, which is kind of interesting. I wonder if Iran insisted that that wasn't put in because they're trying to maintain their strategic independence, and not fall into the trap that Syria fell into, really, whereas Syria had already, to a large degree, lost its sovereignty. It had lost its central governance because how many players were influencing Syria? You had Russia, Iran, Turkey, the Gulf states, America, UK, EU, etc., etc. They all had a finger in Syria's internal affairs, basically. And I think Iran learned from what happened in Syria. I think anyway, Iran would have maintained this kind of strategic independence anyway. So at the same time, I do think both Russia and China understand that they can't allow Iran to fall because they're next. Iran is strategically very important for both countries. And actually, Fiorella told me that in Russia, there is quite a change of consensus since the Israeli aggression against Iran, and Iran was perceived to have held its own against two nuclear powers. Israel, of course, being the most psychopathic with the Samson doctrine and all the rest of it. The most likely in the world today to use nuclear, in my opinion, is Israel.
Yeah.
And I think it earned Iran a lot of respect in Russia. As it did globally. I mean, I saw a massive change in popular opinion towards Iran during the 12 days. It was quite extraordinary, even on social media. There was like a complete change from people who'd been propagandized into believing, the women's rights stuff, despite the fact that we have historical context of the US using women's rights to effectively target sovereign nations. Ergo, Afghanistan. Well, let's have a look at women's rights right now in Afghanistan, since the US interfered for the last 25 years. But I think they switched very much from believing all of the media propaganda and human rights propaganda against Iran to like, wow, because the first 8 hours, it was horrible. I mean, we were sitting here just like, what the hell has happened? Because the air defense wasn't working. The assassinations were coming in one after the other. I mean, it was horrendous. Yeah. But they rallied, and they did actually tremendous damage, both to Israel infrastructure, but also to the US bases in Qatar, which the US, of course, is not admitting. But the satellite images are showing that actually quite a lot of damage was done by the Iranian attack.
Vanessa, we've come to the top of the hour, and I want to just thank you so much for sharing these insights. And certainly, I mean, without an appreciation for this context, for the subtleties, we're going to fall into the exact same traps that when you look at history, this is like the theme of history is people falling for imperial traps based upon their psychological profiles, tribal concerns, their tendency to think myopically about the future, about their environment, about the actual players lighting fires behind the scenes, and it always happens, right? 19th century, that's what the British Empire was doing to influence Turkey to expand and break up Britain's rival Russia, and we have it everywhere we look. So we definitely need to take stock of these things because the potential is so
Yeah.
beautiful and so good for the future in some ways, but in other ways, it's dismally scary to think about the downslide that human civilization can possibly fall into that would take
Yeah.
countless generations and if not centuries to recover from. And it's if you think about it, it's just so unacceptable that we would allow
Mm.
for that type of trajectory and downslide into a dark age. So again, I just appreciate your assessments, your courage so much. I don't know if there's any final thoughts you'd like to tell the people where they can read your stuff, where they can support you,
Yeah,
as
they
well
can
as general
support me
thoughts too. Yeah.
no, they can support me at Substack. That's the main one. That's easy. They can follow me on Telegram and X and all the normal places. I think my final thought has to be because I've been speaking to people on the coast in Syria, friends in Sweden, and kind of even with them trying to cut through the hideousness of what they're experiencing, for them to understand what's going on. And their appreciation of that understanding that this isn't a war only against the Druze or only against the Alawites or only against the resistance. Also, it's a war against all of us to, as you said, to foment hatred, whether it's through racism, sectarianism, supremacism, it doesn't matter. You know, that's what's happening at the moment through all these devices, through war, through, farmer hoaxes, it really doesn't matter what it is. That's what's happening. It's what's happening now in Europe and the UK. People are turning against Muslims because of the takfiri elements that their own government radicalized and exported to Syria to rape and burn and massacre Syrians, and they're now coming back to the UK. Well, who's the enemy? The government's the enemy, not the Muslims, right? So we've all got to start, and myself included, understanding that this is a war against us as human beings to maintain our humanity, our compassion, our morality, our integrity, and to develop that to a point where it's unassailable, regardless of what situations we're plunged into, which we are going to be at some time in the very near future, all of us. And to understand also that what's happening in Syria isn't some isolated incident. We're all connected. What's happening in Syria, in Palestine, it's going to happen to us to a larger or lesser degree, but it's coming. And we're going to have to deal with it. And we're going to have to right now prepare for it. And information is one of the best ways to prepare for it. I'm often accused of kind of blackpilling people, but I'm actually not, because when I see the humanity and the people in Sweden in the middle of battles, they can think about each other. They can think about saving each other. That for me is something which gives me hope for the future, because in the middle of all that darkness, they can still be searching for some kind of light or some kind of, and it's not a savior up there or in government or in, it's something in themselves that they refuse to allow to be broken. And that for me is, I'm just heading more and more towards understanding this and strengthening it in myself and helping other people in whatever way I can to strengthen it within themselves. Because we're all going to need that. We're all going to need that inner integrity to be able to deal with what's coming down the track. Sorry,
Yeah,
that was a
I
bit
think
of
no, that was beautiful. That was important. No, philosophically, I think that's one of the most important things you could have said, because the big battle I think that allows us to fall victim to the machinations of evil is this cynicism about human nature, which the oligarchy has been very good
yeah.
at getting us to become pessimists and to look at ourselves and look at our fellow human beings as the worst aspect of ourselves, kind of like the way the oligarchy wants us or sees us, is how they want us to see ourselves, as viruses, as pollution machines, as selfish little hedonistic animals that can't even think about anything bigger than our local concerns. And to the degree that we fall prey to that, and I mean, shows that we are fed on Netflix and on Amazon Prime or Prime Video, all of these, the shows, the movies, the themes all reinforce, surviving in a zombie apocalypse where most humans suck. Like they're if we're
Yeah,
shown
yeah,
scenarios of the future, they're always bad. It's
yeah,
always some post
yeah,
cataclysmic or cataclysmic scenario that's setting the tempo. Machines are out to
yeah,
kill us, or zombies or whatever, and all of the humans in that future world suck. You can only trust your immediate tribe, and otherwise
yeah,
everybody else is out to backstab you to get that food
yeah,
scrapping that's there in some depot or some corner
yeah,
store that's not been ravaged yet. um, the reality is when you actually look at the case studies of people who have survived crises, our true human nature does tend to come out and demonstrate that we are
yeah,
much more solution oriented, dignified, problem solving, even at the worst of times. Which the oligarchy doesn't want us to think about that, because that awakens a sense that maybe
mm,
human beings are actually so much more than what empires demand us to be. Maybe we have this more divine,
yeah,
beautiful destiny in the grand scheme of things, which would help us sort of judge and discern the injustices and what's wrong about the world that we live in,
yeah,
and thus, think through pathways towards more healthy natural law
yeah.
orientation. So I think what you just said is totally great. That's a fantastic way to end it. And yeah, thank you. So for everybody watching, go to Vanessa Beeley's Substack, subscribe, support her work, follow her work. She puts out amazing regular content on UK column as well. So make sure to get that on your agenda. Vanessa, thank you so much, and I look forward to future conversations with you going forward.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me on.